Okay, after a little over a year of working on my J30 with a Balsa core hull, I'm nearly complete with the project, and I've seen some new questions come up on what's involved in drying a Balsa core, and I thought I'd try to take a few minutes to summarize what works, what doesn't work, and why. So I'll kind of recount some of the history. I did a lot of research before I started on this project. Didn't do enough before I bought my boat maybe, but once I learned I had the problem, I did get into it pretty extensively and try to sort out solutions. One of them was to use high vacuum. This is my vacuum pump down here, and heat. The idea being is that if I could heat the core up enough, I could draw the moisture out of the hull, and to a point that worked. But the challenge is that the result was uneven, and here in a second I'll explain part of the reason that does or doesn't work. But let me show you the tools that are required to do this kind of work. And I've done all of the work from the outside, and I'll explain why as well. But here's what you need. You're going to need some safety equipment: gloves, safety glasses, a face mask, whatever. Minimum of a respirator, and I often find myself using a full face respirator so that I don't get the grit in my eyes as well, and that's an important point. So this stuff's flying everywhere. When I first started, I was using a flat bar, and I had sharpened it so that it helped shear the skin away from the balsa core. You need a hammer to drive it. And very quickly I decided that was entirely too much work and too slow. So that's when I went to a pneumatic chisel. And the trick there was to track down a wider blade. And then the second part of the trick that I figured out was to cut the skin in smaller pieces rather than trying to peel it off as one big sheet or something. I found that cutting the skin into about 4 by 4 pieces and then prying those away was much less damage to the balsa core, and the effort required to pry it away, even with the pneumatic chisel tool, was dramatically less. I started out just going back and forth between the metal cutoff wheel, which is what this is, putting the cutoff wheel on my 4-inch grinder, but that became tedious and slow, so I bought a cheapo small 4-inch grinder and put the cutoff wheel on it. And there's lots of ways to cut the fiberglass. I just found that this was quick and simple, and these blades last a long time. If you're trying to use like a multi-tool or something, you're going to go through a lot of really expensive blades, and to no great result. The other thing you're going to want is a large supply of 36 grit and some 80 grit discs for your sander, because once you get the skin off, you're not done. In order to be able to dry the balsa, you need to, after that outer skin is off, you still have to grind through it and get the polyester resin off of the end grain of the balsa. Another tool that you're probably going to want to have is some kind of a moisture meter, because what you're going to need to start understanding is this problem is kind of an interesting thing in physics, I think, because as an example, think of it this way. If Here's a piece of new dry balsa. If I put this damp sponge inside this sandwich bag with that balsa, guess what happens to the dry balsa? It very soon will absorb the moisture from this sponge. So one of your challenges is that as you work and either dry or replace the balsa, depending on what is required, you need to be thinking about the fact that adjacent to your work area is probably more wet balsa. So you need to coat the edges with epoxy or whatever, but somehow or another you need to solve that problem. And in my case, in many of the large cases where I had to do balsa replacement, I used a Divinycell so that it just doesn't absorb moisture no matter what. You could put it inside the bag with the wet sponge and there'd be no result. But if you're drying the balsa, which I have done a lot of, then yeah, you need to sort out some way to keep the dry balsa from getting resaturated. And some things to know is that one of your challenges is to sort out the multiple sources of moisture that have contributed to saturating your balsa. And in the case of polyester resin, the thing to know is that it is not impervious to water. Water will slowly but surely migrate through it, and that is part of the osmosis process, and I'm not going to go into that. But the other things that I found, particularly in my boat, is when they constructed it, somebody made the genius decision to do a lot of fastening by drilling and screwing directly through the inner skin. So even if you fix the or repair or dry the balsa, if you don't get in and stop moisture from getting back into the core from all of its sources, you're not done, and you're not going to be done. So like I said, make sure that you're dealing with all of the sources of moisture, which several of them can very easily be on the interior of the skin. In the case of the J30, there's the screw holes from fastenings. There's also a goofy thing called a vermiculite dam that was a bunch of material they put between the bottom of the sole and the bottom of the boat to make the sole be more stiff. Well, that was a bad idea that needs to be addressed in the J30s. But in any case, main thing is the interior of the hull is just as important as to solving your problems as the exterior. And one of your challenges is that the hull, while it may have wet areas, also has dry areas, and you really need to make sure you're addressing the very wettest of areas first, so that they don't help contribute to your problem. So here is my J30, and these are areas that have been dried. You can actually see areas where I replaced sections of balsa that were severely damaged, either from being either oversaturated or the balsa had deteriorated, and I replaced those sections with Divinycell. Last fall, and I had the boat sitting on a wooden cradle that I built, and so now I'm just finishing up. Now that the weather's improving enough, I'm finishing up drying the sections that were under the cradle. And some of the things that are interesting are that some of the areas that had been repaired and were dry, and this is not a perfect example of it, but these areas were 100% dry or reading less than 12% moisture. And because this was saturated over here, these areas started coming back up. So again, once you fix part of your problem, you got to make sure that you have isolated the wet from the dry areas. So in this case, the process was pretty quick because this is a small area, but so what I was able to do in this area was to peel the outer skin, grind down through and grind off all of the remaining polyester resin, and I applied a little bit of heat, and I had some dry days, so I was able to dry the balsa and didn't need to replace any of it. Then what I did is I used some low density fairing filler and a couple coats of fairing filler to get a nice, reasonably smooth surface. And then there are 2 layers of 20-ounce glass over that, and I'll come back and add more to that as well. But that's how that was done. So here is the rear cradle area, and it's been raining again. So this is what the balsa looks like after just peeling that outer skin off. And over here, this is an area where I haven't ground off all of the polyester resin. It's a little darker. And again, this area has had heat applied to it, and I haven't checked it this morning, but it's showing as dry at this point in time. So what's important is that the balsa, once it's dry, is very rigid. I mean, it doesn't compress, it doesn't do anything. It's, you know, it's back to normal as soon as it dries out. Now, come around the corner, and this is a vain attempt to try to keep rain off to make it not be worse. And I may include some still pictures of this, but this is right under the galley sink where some screws were put through the inner skin, and I'll bet $1, see if that's coming through, that if I dig through that, which I will, you'll find a hole from a screw head on the inner skin. And this is crazy wet to the touch. I think this is all going to end up having to be replaced. I had big trouble over in this area trying to dry the balsa over here, and I think the reason for that is that with this area being so wet, again, once you start drying over here, it basically starts pulling moisture through the balsa. So this will be get the chisel out and remove a bunch of balsa and replace it. And I've been, again, replacing with the Vinicel because I have it, and once you replace it with the Vinicel, you don't have to worry about the moisture moving through it. And then this is the last remaining area that I have to work, and so today I'll be using the grinder with that metal cutoff blade, and I'll score this multiple times, and my cut lines will go back past where I had left off on both sides, and then I'll grind back for that 12:1, and then my overlap will probably be several inches either side of that. Okay, I've marked the area that I'm gonna work, and like I said, the boundaries put me out into areas that I've previously worked, and I was just checking, and this is not the most serious area that I've encountered by any means. A couple of spots, like in here, are a little higher. These are 3 on my electrophysics FRP scale, which is pretty wet, but didn't peg the needle by any means. Some of this area up above is less wet, but as soon as you get that skin off and remove the polyester resin, you can fully dry it so it doesn't contribute to not saturating, but contaminating essentially your dry area. So you can, by reducing the entire region, you don't have to worry about the levels coming back up in an area that you've worked. So what I'll do next is I'll get the camera on a tripod and I'll show you using both the pry bar and then the pneumatic chisel. And if you're doing a lot of this work, you really want the pneumatic chisel. If you were doing a small area, using the pry bar is probably totally adequate if you don't have access to the pneumatic chisel. But if you got a lot of it to do, you do not want to be hammering that much. It's a lot of work. Okay, step one is scoring the polyester fiberglass skin, and again using a 4-inch grinder with a metal cutoff blade. You can see that I'm barely penetrating, a little more than an 8/3/16 into the skin, and that does leave a score mark in the balsa, but that doesn't concern me because that just gets filled with the filler. The main thing is to get through all of the skin, which up in this area is all chop strand mat. Down lower, closer to the keel, you will encounter some woven roving, but not a lot of that, at least on this boat. Okay, if you were going to do it with the flat bar, you saw how that works. It's a lot of work, but it can be done. If there's any trick to it, it's sharpen the edges of your bar so it can get into the kerf cut, and then what you're trying to do is shear that skin away from the balsa, not pry. If you pry, you're going to damage the balsa and you'll end up having to replace the damage, so don't do that. Now I'm going to show you the preferred tool. This is the pneumatic chisel. This one's an Ingersoll Rand. Looks like it says it's an 11.4 GQC air hammer. Anyway, it doesn't take a lot of air. You could run this thing easily with a small portable compressor, because well, just watch, you can see it's easy. So the trick to this is the small squares that I'm trying to do. Like I said, about 4 by 4, and you just kind of work the edges as it peels away. If you do larger, what you tend to find is you end up trying to pry, and prying damages the balsa and just makes for more work than is necessary. The thing with the damp or wet balsa is that it's really soft, and if you try to pry on it, it just squishes and bad things happen. So try to be careful with it, because if you dry it, then you don't have to replace it. Okay, took barely a couple minutes to peel all that skin off. Now the hard part starts. In that same area, I'll start grinding off the remaining fibers from the chop strand and start exposing the end grain balsa. So hopefully the lens on the camera won't get completely inundated in the process. Okay, this is the hard part, and what you're trying to get to is that nice light color. That's actually the end grain balsa. Where it's still amber, that's still the polyester resin, and that all needs to come off. But once you've exposed that nice light colored balsa, this stuff will dry out, and I can probably check real quick. What do we got? We're reading about 0.6 here, 0.8 here. Down here we're pegging the meter. So for the next 15-20 minutes I'll be grinding this stuff off. I think this is a section that can be air dried and help with some heat. I don't think I have to do any replacement here. Now sometimes you will get, there's a pretty good divot here. Again, that happens because this is, when it's damp, it's extra soft. So when you burn through that resin, all of a sudden sometimes you'll dig in and start removing way too much balsa. It happens. Don't get excited about it. Try to avoid it. But again, that's all going to get filled with low density filler, and just part of the fun. One thing that is important is you really want a big supply of these 36 grit discs, because since you're working overhead, you really don't want to be working hard, and when this starts losing its bite, you're spending more time and using way more muscle effort than is required. You change this disc out and the cut rate goes up exponentially. So buy them in large packages of 25 and prepare to have multiple packages, because you're going to go through a bunch of these things. Should also mention that while you're going to use lots and lots of the 36 grit, you do want a supply of the finer grit. I think this is 60, but I think I also have some 80s and maybe even some 100 or finer. There are times when you're trying to do a little bit finer detail work, and the slower grinding or cutting of the higher grit is helpful. This stuff is great for making material go away, but in some cases that's not helpful. You want to go slow, so switch to the higher grit. Also helpful to remember what the hell size your grinder is. 4.5 is the right size, not 5 like this one is, but I got them and they work. So anyway, that's the fun of it.
Okay, this area probably measures about 18-20 inches wide, 36 maybe 40 inches top to bottom, and probably took me maybe 15 minutes to get the skin off with the chisel tool, the pneumatic chisel, and then probably a pleasant 45 minutes of grinding over my head with that 4-inch grinder. And that's the hard work. This is all overhead and not fun. Just put the meter on it, and this whole area is reading 3 or 3+ on my meter. I'm gonna go have some lunch, go buy some propane, and I'll come back, put some heat on it, and see if we can dry it. There are some areas that could probably stand being replaced. Let's see if I can get my hand out of here. We'll see if this stuff dries. If it doesn't, then it's going. Key thing is to expose the end grain of the balsa. If you don't get that polyester off the end grain, you will not dry this stuff out. And what I found is that in rechecking, if I get an area that doesn't seem to want to dry, I'll get the grinder out and re-sand the area a little bit, because there may be some resin that has penetrated far enough into the end grain to cause a problem. This, at least to touch, this doesn't feel overly damp as compared to the other end down there. It's wet to the touch. I've got some solid core in front of the drain over here, and that's what you're seeing. And before I do any glass work, I'll be pushing these edges back quite a bit further, but I just got them back far enough now so that I can expose the end grain. More sanding to do before we glass this back up. And I don't know, hopefully that gives you an idea what this looks like. It's hard to tell what this camera actually picks up. Again, these small divots and whatnot, I've decided those are not worth bothering to replace as long as they are firm. If they're not, then like this is pretty soft over here, but I think once it dries out, it'll go back to being fine. But again, it's wet now, so the way it behaves wet is not the same as when it's dry. So you can make a decision whether you want to bother replacing it. And I think the replacing issue comes down to whether or not you can dry it or not. If you can dry it, then it comes back to having most of the characteristics you want. And like these divots, when you refill them with the epoxy low density filler, it ends up being as strong or stronger than the balsa ever was. So I think that